Hi, everybody. I spoke this morning using this computer with Jerome Lesemann, Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo, British Columbia. And the conversation is just me asking what happened last week after I left Jerome in the field. I don't know if you saw a video that I put on my YouTube channel where I was following Jerome around in the field and looking at Ice Age flood ripples and terraces, flats, alluvial fans, etc. But this is just a follow-up conversation to hear about the continued fieldwork of Jerome. And that got us into more of the discussion, kind of a follow-up discussion to things we were talking about in the field. But the main point is Jerome reports that last week his fieldwork in the Okanagan Valley of northern Washington was energizing. He's got a bunch of new ideas spinning around, and it's great to see him so charged up. And I'm hoping that we can all follow his progress as he collaborates with other geologists and continues his own work, ultimately talking about pretty significant amounts of water during the Ice Age coming north to south down the Okanagan Valley from British Columbia to Washington. So, here's our conversation earlier today. Well, is it still a terrace story to you, or is it more local little fans and things, or is it all the same thing? Is it all the smaller features fit into the bigger narrative as you see it now?
So, boy, that's a complex question. It's all of the above, I think, in a way, and it's really about teasing out which parts are when. But definitely a terrace story. But like we said in the field, I don't know exactly why, but my focus is on the highest surface. Like, to me, that is really a key one, because many of well, I guess I know why. Is because I feel like that upper surface is the main material. Let's call it the material dump into the valley or into whatever you're doing, right?
That's it.
And then after that, clearly there are terraces. Clearly there's been erosion and incision. And yes, if you think of the process to create those terraces, there's a channel that must be migrating or moving to some degree. So there's going to be a bit of a deposit on that surface. But above, overwhelmingly, I think we're incising. We're removing material from that initial deposit, which is the upper surface, the highest. So that's why I'm focused on that one. It becomes an issue or a question of what is the Great Terrace? And that is not an easy or simple answer, because different people have different views of it. I mean, some people, I think everybody agrees that Brewster is sort of the epicenter of the Great Terrace, and that includes, a couple of steps or a couple of flights of terraces that have incised the highest surface. But some trace it south to Chelan. But others, like Flint, traces it back, and I say back northward up the Okanagan to Tenasket. And I would argue that it probably goes back even further.
Okay.
So the way I'm so all that thinking got me thinking about, okay, so how do we make sense of these deposits and those initial deposits? And the way I'm seeing it is that I think this Great Terrace is a huge diachronous deposit. You know what I mean by that?
No.
Okay, so it's a deposit that we can trace. So I'm going to work from the morphology angle, like the upper surface, but knowing that morphology contains sediment, right? But it's diachronous in the sense that it's a single surface we can correlate with some reasonable sort of accuracy, but it has very different ages in different places. Does that make sense? So if you think of depositing the sediment that makes the Great Terrace, maybe we start building that surface when the Okanagan lobe is very far close to its southern margin, right? And then during retreat, we keep supplying meltwater and we keep supplying sediment. So the age of the Great Terrace, the age of the sediment that then makes this upper bench, is very different at its southern end than it is at its northern end. That's what makes it diachronous.
Getting the material getting gradually younger as you go north?
Correct. That would be the idea. In a very simplistic,
Right.
sequential retreat northward because
Right.
I'm not sure that's actually the pattern of retreat, but this is the way that segments of it are probably diachronous to some. So we correlate based on an elevation, but probably having to recognize that that surface is actually incrementally built to some degree. And this is really where there needs to be a better understanding of what the environment of deposition is. Is it really like a valley fill that covers the whole thing across? Or is it deposited in local ponds because there's some ice around that dams little basins here and there, and then we're building a surface? But if that's the case, why are they at the same elevation? To me, that's a response to a single base level. So,
right.
But the other thing you can think about it, that got me thinking during the trip and driving back, especially because, long road and just lots of thoughts, is that there's reasonably another diachronous surface that could correspond to the Great Terrace during glacial advance, right? Because as you build the Cordilleran ice sheet, you produce lots of meltwater, even during right? So as the ice sheet is growing, the Okanagan Valley would reasonably be an area where we have a valley train, an outwash train building. And so we would be building deposits of sand and gravel of outwash. They would be quickly overridden by ice, right? Because the ice is advancing in front of its own deposit. Yeah. But it's constantly shunting forward material, right? So that when the ice sheet, when the Okanagan lobe gets to its maximal extent, like its southern boundary, it's also shedding outwash, most likely. And that would go directly down the Columbia. So it's entirely possible that I don't know how much of that glacial onset surface would be preserved. I would say probably very little, because there's been so much erosion and incision through the Okanagan, and subsequently with the floods down the Columbia and so on, and perhaps some down the Okanagan. I don't know how much we would preserve of the actual bench. But what got me on that train of thought is I started looking at elevations and thinking about Chelan as where people sort of draw the boundary. And they draw the boundary because, well, there's a surface as well. There's a flat at Chelan that matches in terms of elevation. But then I looked beyond it, and then I also saw that, you go to Wenatchee, and there's a flat. Wenatchee is built on a flat. And if you go up, what is it? If you go up, is it I don't know what the river is. It Wenatchee? Anyway, if you go towards, is it Icicle Creek? I think if you go up to Leavenworth and beyond, there's cascaded glaciation going on up there.
Yeah.
And they're easy to see, but there's flights of benches or flats that step down from the upper reaches of Wenatchee, in that stretch between Wenatchee and Leavenworth.
Yep.
And there's a very precipitous drop off at the Columbia. Like there's a bench, and then you go right down, something we see all the way up the Okanagan. So that's at Wenatchee, and that's beyond the margin. That's beyond, right? Other than, well, beyond the mapped margin of the Okanagan lobe. Let's just leave it like that, currently mapped.
Okay.
But what also got me thinking about this early on, is that other items that match those elevations are the bars, the big bars in the Columbia. Pangbourne across from Wenatchee, the upper surface of Pangbourne matches roughly that elevation. I don't know the name of the bar upstream of that, but the big one that's between Brewster and Pangbourne, right? A couple bends of the Columbia northward, almost across, I think it's a little downstream from Chelan, one of the more recent ones that Richard Wade is working on. That's within the elevation range awfully close. So I wondered, well, where does all that bar sediment come from? Is it all, and I don't know enough about the current work that's been done on there, but I don't think it's clearly been sort of spelled out, but is it all kind of Leaside, Backheady style deposit during one of the floods? Or is it something pre-existing where during floods we overtop them partially, but we really just we shape them, right? We ornament them with big bed forms and other stuff like that. Because clearly many of these bars have been submerged, because we see that they've been trimmed, they've been incised, right? We can see. So I wondered how much of that bar sediment is in fact a former outwash train when the ice sheet is at its southern margin, basically, right? Because again, even when the ice sheet reaches its southern margin, it's seasonally melting, it's seasonally producing outwash. This doesn't stop. This is an ongoing process all the time. It just happens to ramp up during deglaciation. Mm-hmm. Even during advance, it's doing it. at its maximum, it's doing it. It's going to do a bit of this, seasonal fluctuations of the Okanagan lobe. And then when it really starts retreating, then you really ramp up the meltwater production. But even when it's stationary at glacial maximum, it's going to have some production of outwash. So I wondered how much of that Columbia gravel we see is perhaps sort of glacial maximum to advanced phase outwash that then just gets trimmed by floods later on, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, I don't know if it sort of radically changes things. It was just part of my multiple thoughts that I had that were a bit disjointed over that time. But,
well, how much of the past week are brand new thoughts then to you? Or had you kind of been working along these lines of logic for many years?
I think there were bits and pieces of it, but I think the way of trying to think about, the bars and I hadn't thought of it that way. They're brand new thoughts to me. I'm not going to say they're brand new thoughts in general. I don't know how much people have thought, and I need to catch up on some of that Columbia literature, and especially around the interactions of Cascade ice and Okanagan lobe ice. But anyways, so it's part of the process of just. But those are new thoughts to me, or just ways of trying to think about how to approach the problem. I am perplexed, though, by the fact that, I guess what I'm saying is if we go to Chelan, which is the proposed sort of end of the Great Terrace, if we work backwards, if we're northward and upstream, let's go upstream, we can match elevation-wise really consistently to the Great Terrace surface in Brewster and up to Tenasket. And Sky sent me a pretty quick, rough sort of correlation of my elevation, and it goes into the Columbia Reach towards Lake Columbia, right? So if you go on that east-west segment of the Columbia after the confluence of the Okanagan, that still matches a bit through there. So, again, kind of quick back of the envelope, there seems to be some reasonable pattern. So that is something elevated in reference to today's modern Columbia elevation. So it speaks to a former elevated base level. So when we were in the field, we're saying, so if it's elevated there, and that's where the Great Terrace ends, there must be a blockage. There must be something damming it. And if there's a blockage, either there's an outlet to the blockage for the water to go, otherwise you pond. The moment you block, you pond, and if you pond, you have a bit of a lake-ish. And maybe that's part of the rationale for some people interpreting the strata or documenting strata that seems to be deltaic, but I haven't really seen it. Mm-hmm. So what got me thinking was, well, how do we know for sure that the blockage is at Chelan? And that's why I started looking downstream and realized, well, hold on. Wenatchee has a surface, and so why can't we just continue that surface? And why doesn't it continue downward further? Because the bars are there. So I'm looking at pretty substantial volumes of sediment kind of parked and remaining in protected areas along the course of the Columbia. So, because if there is no blockage, then I would expect a fairly gradual, decrease it would be the former slope of the valley train, however far to the south it extended. Anyways.
Well, this is the part that got me most excited. So I think it was that last morning we were together, and for me, tying the blockage to a terrace level or a flat was a new concept, and especially when you kept saying, if you follow a flat, then it just drops off. If there's an abrupt southern end to a flat, then there's some blockage there or some lake level or that sort of thing. My only point is that, yes, after we parted ways, I'm driving home. I chose to just go down 97 the whole way and keep thinking about that. And I basically said, okay, I'm going to go Brewster and follow 97 to Chelan. I'm still on a terrace. So I'm thinking terrace is the Great Terrace. I'm on the high level. That road is on that high level. I get south of Chelan. I'm still on that Great Terrace, I'm pretty sure, on the east side of the river.
Yeah.
And then from my point of view, I lose that Great Terrace right at Earthquake Point.
Right.
And there's a big jog in the river there and maybe a constriction or something. And then I thought that I lost it there. And what I think I'm hearing you say right now is that maybe that Great Terrace continued down to at least Wenatchee, because you see the top of Pangbourne Bar as being roughly equivalent in elevation. You looked that up, did you?
Yeah. I mean, it's rough, but yeah. But I mean, the challenging thing is that because of the course of the Columbia, and because the course of the Columbia sort of moves between bedrock knobs that stick in and out of the valley, there's lots of places where you can sort of preserve a segment of a terrace while having kind of reamed out the center of the valley. So that you lose it in one place doesn't mean that the surface didn't continue and you have another remnant of it further downstream, right?
Right.
And the Wenatchee thing is, clearly when I look at the Wenatchee situation, I see that the sediment must come from the higher elevations to the west, so sort of Leavenworth towards Wenatchee, at least some of the material. I'm not suggesting that all of Wenatchee is some sort of valley backfill, but perhaps some of it is. I'm just struck by the elevation. I'm struck by the pattern. I'm struck by I know, having been through Wenatchee, I know how coarse some of that material is. And I'm struck by how abrupt it ends at the Columbia, right? How abrupt that is. So, and then that there are other big piles of sediment further down, like the bars. Pangbourne is a substantial volume of material. Like, you got to ask yourself, where does that all come from? Is it all flood material? Because really, that reach of the Columbia doesn't see as much, flood action, at least as far as we, in the current ideas, I guess, it doesn't see as much, as many floods going through it as, say, the eastern Cheney-Palouse and those other areas, right? So when are your opportunities to dump that much material in a reach of the Columbia that is upstream of Moses Coulee and south of the Okanagan Lobe? It's a relatively unaffected segment of the Channel Scablands in terms of the passage of Missoula waters through there. Does that make sense? I think, yeah.
Well, it does, and so the geologists who have worked with Pangbourne Bar, let's say, they note that it's essentially all crystalline rocks. There's hardly any basalt in that material, and it came down the Columbia Valley. That's all conventional wisdom. Where are they saying all that stuff's coming from then?
Well, this is a challenge, right? I mean, if you want crystalline rocks, take your pick, because you got, a source in the Cascades, clearly, and you've got a source to the north. Right. And I think we have to differentiate crystalline rocks, whether they're metamorphic or whether they're not quite as, I mean, I think if you did some detailed work on some of that, or somebody did, we might be able to tease out, proportions of each. I don't know. Yeah.
That wouldn't be that hard, would it? To go through Pangbourne Bar's cobbles and...
Probably not.
Maybe it would be hard, but like, how much of this is Okanagan Dome versus how much of this is Skagit Gneiss, that sort of thing.
And how much of it is Quinella? Because you could have, you got the west, between your Cascade sources and your Okanagan Fault, and your dome to the east, you've got a sliver of Quinella, I think, you're in there. So there might be some lithologies that are actually fairly diagnostic. So that would be an interesting, and it would be interesting if there was access to Pangbourne Bar at different depths below the surface of Pangbourne, because I think that might be an interesting or a different perspective, even just to see the difference in the stratification, that the patterns of the buildup of the bar. Anyways, I guess they're kind of wild thoughts, but they got me thinking.
I don't think they're wild, and just from my limited experience with Pangbourne Bar, with modest giant current ripples mantling it, by the way, at Wenatchee, East Wenatchee, and then, I mean, it could be as simple as that. I keep saying simple. None of this is simple, but it could be as straightforward as just comparing and contrasting between the high flat at Omak with those ripples that you were looking at, and the high flat at Wenatchee with those ripples, and how similar are they with lithology, with depth? You're saying the elevation is essentially the same as the tops, but I mean, that could be a powerful thing just to connect those two things, because if you're at Omak and you've got an identical set of deposits, giant current ripples, everything else, then that's a vote that we're not sending a bunch of Montana water to Wenatchee to create that.
Yeah, or maybe not as much. As in, the Montana water might be trimming a pre-existing pile of sediment, right, or something. Yeah. So those were some of the thoughts. After I left you, just around Brewster, I went into Brewster, and then I drove up one of the very small side channels. There's a place called Rat Lake, and I just went up, and really interesting because it's a relatively narrow kind of, whatever you want to call it, little valley, side valley, but very long.
We're on the west side?
On the west side, yeah. Very long, and just chock full of boulder bars, enormous boulder bars, right? There's a couple of ranches up there, but you got a narrow kind of bedrock canyon. But again, you drive up off the lower surface of Brewster, you drive up, a significant break in slope, and then you kind of end up on this kind of flat or gently sloping upstream surface, and you follow that surface. And floods, no floods, I don't know what, but whatever's happened through there is high energy, because you've got, boulder size, I'm talking here like 2-3 feet across in some places, clusters that have built very clear bars, organized clusters of boulders in very sort of incipient kind of braided channels. So these little side valleys are high energy and perhaps very short-lived, but they're high energy kind of conveyors to the main Okanagan, or at that point Columbia Okanagan kind of basin. Right around Brewster, there's a bit of a widening, and it's kind of yeah. And there was in this case some fine sediments, silty, kind of laminated, but also what I saw was that it was completely deformed because it was loaded by gravel. So there was clearly some boulder gravel deposit on top, and we saw a bit of that at Omak. Remember, we looked at that big flat, and then we rounded the corner. We saw all this deformation where you could. So if you rapidly dump lots of boulders and gravel onto some subaqueous silts that are soft and squishy, you're going to get these sort of injections and deformation and that kind of stuff. So again, a bit of ponded water, but you don't need a giant lake to do that. You just need some local ponding. So, yeah.
Well, as I listen to you, especially when we're talking about this Omak area, it's almost like I want to play a game with you, like a 1 to 5 game. Like 1 is nothing catastrophic here, nothing super high energy. This is the position of the ice sheet, normal stuff, advancing and retreating, depositing, quote unquote, gradually.
Yeah.
And then 5 is there's nothing gradual about this. We're dumping, like you say, we're dumping all the marbles at once.
Yeah.
At one particular date, and trying to tease out where we are on this scale of 1 to 5.
Yeah.
And like right now, you're talking about a dinky little side canyon with huge ass boulders, and so we're closer to 5, I think, right? At some time in the past, I don't know. Like, are you going back and forth on this 1 to 5 scale, like almost every time you're at any particular spot?
Yeah, because I'll tell you why. I mean, and we had this chat indirectly. I think the 1 to 5. We just said, there's an issue, or there's a challenge with using the words like catastrophic flood, because it's such a relative term, and you can have a catastrophic seasonal flood of a river with no influence of anything resembling Missoula. It's catastrophic, but often when we say catastrophic floods, or people use the word catastrophic, they refer to the most cataclysmic mega floods of Missoula, right? So it's a completely relative term, and I think sometimes it kind of muddies the discussions that way.
Yes.
And I think that is particularly relevant when we're talking about deglacial environments, like deglaciation, because a decaying ice sheet is such a potential volume of water, right? There's so much ice there, and we're going to have to melt it to get rid of it.
Right.
And so it's going to generate very, very large quantities of water, even on a seasonal basis, right? Without invoking major catastrophic.
Right.
And I'm using the term, and here I go, right? Just so it's so baked into the thinking, but.
Right. I don't know what other word you're supposed to use, but I get the point. Yeah, I get the point.
Okay, let's put it this way: without invoking some kind of outburst, right? So without invoking some kind of storage and very sudden release of water, the natural hydrologic kind of regime of a decaying ice sheet could produce a fairly steady seasonal flow of water that is orders of magnitude greater than what we now consider to be a fairly sizable river.
Yes.
And that could be the normal discharge seasonally from a decaying ice sheet, which could be. So when we go to the landscape, in the landscape, we see these big boulders. Are they necessarily saying catastrophic in that sense? Or are they saying, ephemeral or rare events of storage and release like an outburst? Or are they just really recording the fact that when you decay an ice sheet, you have so much water that perhaps in the seasonal regime of water production and meltwater production, it's a very high energy environment because there's a lot of water there and there's a lot of sediment to be moved. You see what I'm saying? I
am. Are you saying even the ripples could be seasonal then?
I think those, that's a really good question. If they were seasonal, why don't we see more?
Yes.
And I think everywhere we see ripples in the world, big ripples like that, they tend to be linked to an outburst of some kind, I would say. And not every the best outburst analogs we have today are in Iceland probably. And those are abnormal because they're kind of conditioned by subglacial volcanism, right? So you produce big volumes of water. And I do not know of sets of ripples that have been produced by those floods, which we consider to be catastrophic, right? I mean, they're beyond most any seasonal production of water because of that subglacial volcanic influence. So I think those OMAC bed forms are linked to some sort of drainage, an outburst. And we sort of did some quick back of the envelope, discharge estimates.
Yeah.
But the rest of the terraces, really tough to say.
Well,
I don't know. Yeah.
I hear your diachronous thing, and we didn't talk about that in the field.
No, not at all. And yeah.
And it's not as fun to just have this ice retreat. To kind of lay down all these marbles. I love that Great Terrace, that high level. I want that to be the biggest. I want it to be one event, just as a human being. I want it to be one event. And I think most people do. That's the funnest part that everybody overlooked, But you're starting to, I guess, with the Great Terrace, come back a little bit to what I consider the conventional story, which is just a.
But let me but let's qualify that because I haven't done this yet, but it'll be something that we can do at some point.
Yeah.
But on the LiDAR, even on the highest surface, there's really good channels, really good evidence. We can see the channels. We can map individual braided channels. So we know, for example, that when we build these big flats, the braided pattern indicates to us that it's carrying a lot of sediment. It's got a very high sediment load. That's a very typical relationship between the braided plant form and we know that it's carrying coarse sediment because there's lots of boulders. But we can do some comparisons on channel width and compare it to other systems and get an idea. Are these about within the range of normal today? Are they vastly bigger? We can do some rough estimates of the velocity needed to move some of the boulders. So we can start thinking about quantifying some of those variables that tell us something about magnitude, and whether then after that we can decide, or we can argue and discuss whether that is a steady sort of delivery in terms of magnitude, or whether it's something more episodic, which might involve outbursts. The other thing to consider, and this comes out of the Icelandic literature on Jökulhlaups and outburst floods. There's a paper that was written, I guess it was 15, 20 years ago, anyways, by somebody named Phil Marin. And he kind of just took a step back and said, hey, let's think about these Icelandic outbursts and in general, like Jökulhlaups and outburst floods in the cycles of glaciers. And he has a really great, simple diagram in that. But his basic argument is this. When you build an ice sheet, you store water, especially if you build an ice sheet over the Cordillera, because you got all these valleys and you create blockages and so on.
Right.
So during the cycle of growing an ice sheet, there will be some production of meltwater seasonally as we build the ice sheets, and there's a potential for storing that water. So what we're going to tend to see is a gradual increase in the ice sheet's ability to store water. So you start ponding water, but the ice sheet is getting bigger and bigger, and it's going to be, sort of more buttressed and larger, and the blockage will become easier over time because the ice sheet is getting bigger. At some point, you may have an outburst. And so outbursts during the growth of an ice sheet tend to be really, really big ones, because to overcome, you've got an ice sheet that gets progressively better at ponding. And so if you do get an outburst, it's because you really exceeded a major threshold in terms of retention of water, and then you get a big outburst. And then that pattern reverses itself during deglaciation. You produce tons and tons of water, right, as you're deglaciating and you're melting.
Right.
The ice sheet is losing its capacity to store that water because, it's overall shrinking and retreating and lowering its surface. So you might get outbursts because of all this water being produced. They will tend to be perhaps relatively smaller than when the ice sheet is growing, but they will be more numerous. But one of the key messages, and I think we had a bit of this chat somewhere on one of the roadsides, storage and release is just a normal part of the hydrology. You got to, you can't just say, hey, an ice sheet grows and an ice sheet retreats, and it's all happening proglacially as the steady trickle. There is that steady trickle, but there's also, overprinting that, room for, and in a completely sort of normal part of the hydrological system of ice sheets, room for storage and release of outbursts, which would be, even at that scale, catastrophic in comparison to the more steady trickle. So I'm not abandoning the idea, but because I think it's a reasonable part of it. That's the way I approach it. But then it comes down to, how do we tease out those differences? Are really big braided channels that carry boulders necessarily an outburst flood? Not necessarily. They might just be really high discharge because there's a lot of water being produced, right? So we need more lines of evidence to argue for the outburst. And so then you have to think ripples or big bed forms. That might be a real kind of, as close to maybe a bit of a smoking gun as you can get. And then where we went up that Tunk Creek, when I start seeing lake or lacustrine sediments over broad areas, where I see spillways, where I see, divide crossings, that lake gives me evidence of maybe some storage, which then maybe releases at other times. So, yeah, it's not straightforward in terms of an association.
It's not. However, this conversation has already taken one leap that I think most of our viewers and maybe American geologists who are familiar with these concepts, in Washington at least, they're maybe going, wait a minute, they're trying to decide how much is catastrophic versus normal coming down the Okanagan. We're already discussing like that's a thing. And maybe the last thing we can do, Jerome, is if you're on the American side, you're assuming, I don't really know the geography up there in BC, but I assume most of that water from that decaying and melting Okanagan lobe is heading west and heading towards Vancouver, BC.
Not really, no. Well, I mean, okay, two things. One thing before we get to that part, because that requires some geography. In a way, if you're, I want to put that nicely.
You're all now we can edit this part out. I don't mean to put you in a weird spot. It's just
it's good. I'm just measuring my words.
Okay.
If you're in Central Washington, your reference for catastrophic is like one of arguably two worldwide examples of the most catastrophic things that have probably, in terms of water and floods, that have occurred. So you're not dealing with the normal catastrophic. You're way off the charts, like completely off, So
with Grand Coulee and what's a couple other
examples? Everything. Grand Coulee, Cheney Palouse, in terms of quantities, in terms of velocities, in terms of extent of effects on the landscape, in terms of the size of West Bar and other small, it's all off the charts.
That's our measuring stick, off the charts. Got it.
But if that's the measuring stick and that becomes your reference for everything else, then
Right.
you'll always be disappointed. But you know what I mean, right?
I do.
Very few things will live up to that expectation of catastrophic because it's the extreme of the extreme, right? So there's a need to step back from that most extreme of the extremes, which still leaves plenty of room for very high energy, high discharge, high sediment volume transport, perhaps catastrophic, events. And everything that I've described, I think, exists, and there's a record of it in parts of the Scablands, or at least in Lake Columbia and Missoula, because the lake doesn't fill overnight, and when it drains, it does so much geomorphic work of eroding that it wipes out probably a good part of the record of the more steady, gradual, seasonal meltwater input, which also, when we talk meltwater, also means sediment into the lake in Missoula. Mm-hmm. And Larry Smith's work on those big gravel bed forms down basically the Clark Fork shows us that when the lake drains, at least some of the drainages, it's serious. Like there's serious currents moving through that lake, and it's mobilizing a lot of material. And if we're creating these big gravel kind of mounds and bed forms along the drainage route, because it's not even the Scabland flood route, it's the drainage route within the lake basin. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of finer sediment that is basically bypassing all of that. It's suspended and it's moving away, and it's heading straight for Idaho and then to Washington. So, and in Lake Columbia, there's complex records of rhythmites and varves that speak to this kind of steady, probably seasonal or close to seasonal, whatever seasonal exactly is in a glacial environment that way, input of sediment, and we're preserving some of it. So again, like the Okanagan lobe should behave, there's no physical reason why it would behave differently. Yeah. And so it's entirely reasonable, I think, to expect that there would be some proglacial sediment delivery from the Okanagan lobe when it's at its maximum. And so, anyways, now back to the question on where's the water going. Doesn't it go down to the west? So if we take the Okanagan Valley in Washington at the confluence of the Columbia, we'll just go geographically that way.
Good.
There's almost a straight south to north continuity of the valley all the way to the town of Vernon in southern British Columbia. So at that point, we are, as the crow flies, almost 200 kilometers from the U.S. border on the Canadian side. We've passed Penticton, Kelowna. We're north of Kelowna. When we get to Vernon, a little bit further than Vernon, there's a place called Salmon Arm, if people are familiar with it. The Trans-Canada Highway goes through Salmon Arm. We're a bit of at a divide in terms of the valleys in that location. Mm-hmm. There's a series of large, very deep lakes called Shuswap Lake that is an extension of the Okanagan in many respects. So the deeply incised, relatively young valley fill, sand gravel in the Okanagan, that continues around Vernon, Salmon Arm. The lakes reappear in the Shuswap area, and they also have fairly simple, very deep sediment fills. So we're now adding an extra close to 100 kilometers to that system. Okay. At that location around Salmon Arm, there's an east-west valley that connects to the Okanagan or Shuswap, and that's the Thompson River Valley. That's where the city of Kamloops lies. And if you go from that area westward along the Thompson, you go through the city of Kamloops, you get to Cache Creek, namesake for the Cache Creek terrain, and then you can that river then drains to the Fraser through Spence's Bridge, for people who are familiar with those places, and Lytton, a little town that was terribly burned during the fires last summer, but that connects to the Fraser. So if you want to have water during deglaciation that drains to the Fraser, the point where that's going to happen is a fair distance away from the southern margin of the Okanagan lobe, because you got to roughly be around north of Vernon, Salmon Arm. Sure, there's going to be slightly different drainage divides, and there are lakes, glacial lakes in the Okanagan. There's glacial lakes very likely in the Shuswap Basin. There's glacial lakes in the Thompson Basin around Kamloops. Beautiful examples of lake sediments there. and those lakes might connect over current divides to some degree. There's some connectivity, and it's a bit of a patchwork probably of ice masses that temporarily dam these lakes, right? So it's not a straightforward like roll up the curtain, like roll up the Okanagan lobe northward as it retreats, because it's patchy.
Yes,
that's part of the, I think, unclear story of deglaciation. Is like, what exactly is the pattern? Is it really this kind of stepwise orderly retreat, or is it something much patchier where you keep ice on some summits and less in the valley? So we don't need to get into all these details, but nonetheless, there's a huge, and I mean very long, segment of the southern margin of the Cordilleran ice sheet that must drain southward.
Must drain southward. Just from the
topography.
Yes.
Just from the topography.
So why is this narrative continuing? You don't have to answer that. It's just obviously that's my interest in this. In addition to feeling like I can talk easily with you and you have a good sense of what is going on down here with this channel and everything, that's a plus. But just the fact that we can get into the minutia, and is it gradual? Is it regular seasonal outbursts? Everything else. There's this. What was the distance again from Withrow, Washington, to that town at that divide?
Yeah, I'm thinking. I'm just trying to think. It's probably close to 350, 400 kilometers. And we can throw into the mix isostatic rebound, which is also something that's not well constrained, but I don't think it radically alters the fact that when the ice sheet is retreating, the main pathway, because remember, it's not all open at once, but the main pathway is always the local topographic low, which is Okanagan Valley if you're in that segment of the world, right? But you can move one range over to the east, and you have the same pattern. If you look at the map of southern BC today, the southern margin to the border and beyond is valleys, north-south valleys with big lakes, or if no lake, major throughways. So it's a pattern that's not unexpected. And really, like, how do you fill Lake Missoula? Well, you fill Lake Missoula because you have a natural southward drainage along the Rocky Mountain Trench that leads to the basin of Lake Missoula, and that water comes out of the Cordilleran ice sheet. So it's just a replication of the same pattern.
There's these north-south gutters coming across the border.
They're gutters. They're gutters. That's exactly the best way to think about it. And you get the odd branching off of the gutter, but it doesn't radically change the overall picture.